So we're supposed to walk a little bit over to this side of the stage.
Invisible
while
chairs.
they do a scene change.
Let's do it.
And we're going to pretend that nobody's listening to us. And I'm going to say, Adam, hearing you talk, I think I've understood the 2-word phrase that will unearth your deepest feelings about these and every other issues. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. Go blue.
Go blue.
Right.
2 Michigan alums here. We couldn't resist.
3. So, you wrote a lot of books. Your first book, Give and Take, rocketed to the top of the bestseller list. And we're going to sit here and talk about it.
Let's do it.
Hi, Adam.
Oh, hey, Larry. How's it going?
Good, good.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming over. So in Give and Take, you talk about that, really, the old expression, it is in giving that we receive.
I do. Yeah, I think a lot of people underestimate the power of generosity when you look at not just our happiness, but also our success. In the short run, a lot of givers fail. Right? They end up sort of doing other people's jobs instead of their own. But in the long run, they end up building stronger relationships and reputations, and they also learn more than takers and matchers, which is kind of fascinating to me. The time you spend solving other people's problems actually gives you new knowledge to solve your own problems. And over time, right, as we play that out over years or decades, it actually accumulates into an expertise advantage.
In option B, your other book, which is rocketing to the top of the bestseller list, was Cheryl. When Cheryl's husband died, somebody who all of us who knew him loved him in unthinkable circumstances. She struggled for a very long time right after the funeral, and then she began to learn that in giving, she felt fuller again. And for a while, she felt only grief. And then she consciously began a routine of trying to help somebody else who was hurting. What's it like writing that book with Sheryl Sandberg?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is right after the funeral, she pulled a group of family and friends aside, and I guess I'm her only psychologist friend, so I was the token person to ask. And the question she asked was not, how do I get through this? It was, how do I help my children get through this? And I think that was something I saw over and over again, right? That she became resilient because she was trying to help others become resilient. And I think when others are depending on us, we often find strength that we didn't know we had. But I think that very often, as we were talking about like the ideas and then trying to write the book, it was really hard to sort of overcome the grief. And I remember like in the early days, she would call and she would say, "I'm so sorry to bother you. I don't want to burden you. I don't want to dump like all my problems on you." And she would, like, it got to a point where she would call and I would answer the phone and it would just be like, "I'm so sorry." I'd be like, "Who is this?" And then eventually I just said, look, like if you keep like feeling guilty about asking for help, about being willing to let other people give for once, then it's gonna be really hard to recover. And so I banned the word sorry. I said, like, you're not allowed to say I'm sorry anymore. So Cheryl calls me the next day and she says, "I apologize." That doesn't count either, right? But I think so often when people are facing any kind of adversity, whether it's loss or illness or incarceration, one of the things they have a hard time with is actually letting other people help them and be there for them and support them. And I think that one of the things we need to do is we need to recognize that actually one of the greatest acts of friendship that we can give when we're struggling is allowing other people to give to us and receiving the help and support and compassion they might want to show and express. I think the other part of this is the biggest question we've gotten about option B, hands down, has not been how do I find resilience, but how do I help other people who are going through some kind of hardship. And I have to say it's really disappointing that if you go to a bookstore, there's a gigantic self-help section, but there's no help others section anywhere, which is a great statement about America. But I think that one of the things we need to think about is how do we help others when they're going through the worst events in lives, which unfortunately we all do.
Well, you should feel very proud of that book, and people should read this incredible book, Option B. I find many people are giving it as gifts to other people who are going through loss and grief, so you're accomplishing part of your objective there. In a setting like this, when we've sort of designated this space, this special part of Dreamforce to talk about soft issues, talk about love and kindness and compassion. It's easier to talk about these issues. How do you raise this subject when you're doing a regular conversation? You do a lot of speaking before Fortune 500 companies. Can you interject this? And how do you talk about resilience and grief in that setting?
So I usually sort of, I bring it in a Trojan horse. So I start by talking about resilience and say, look, we know every organization needs resilience, right? When the economy goes bad, when a competitor might put one of your major divisions out of business, when a team is struggling professionally, right? What do? How do we bounce back or even bounce forward from those kinds of difficulties? And then inevitably, when we start to raise those issues, somebody will say, well, what about personal resilience? I'm like, it's funny you should mention that. We know some things about that. I think there's a lot we can do from a corporate policy standpoint to try to improve things. So there was a man who wrote something really, really sad and profound. He said he got 3 months off when his son was born and 3 days off when his son died. And companies the policies around bereavement leave are atrocious. After Cheryl lost Dave, she worked with the HR team to expand Facebook's policies from 10 to 20 days if you lose an immediate family member. Now a whole bunch of companies are jumping on that bandwagon. I think it's about time that the companies show that kind of compassion. We actually have some evidence that it actually helps. So does anybody remember Borders, the bookstore? Like a long time ago.
Yeah, Ann Arbor, started in Ann Arbor.
Exactly, so some colleagues and I studied a program that they developed, which unfortunately vanished with the company. It was a foundation that they created for employee support. And they said, look, in a retail industry where salaries are really low, it's often hard for people to weather, sort of life-threatening or expensive events. And so they created a fund and they invited employees to donate just even $1 from their paycheck every week. And you could apply for a grant to help you out if you couldn't afford a scholarship or couldn't get a scholarship or afford school for your kids, if you'd gone through loss, if a natural disaster destroyed your house. And the company would match all the donations that came in from employees. We went in to study this, and we found that it was not only the right thing to do, it was also the smart thing to do. Because employees who were even aware that the program existed, even if they hadn't benefited from it personally, they were more committed to the company. They said, I'm proud to work for a company that has a heart, and I'm grateful to know that there's a safety net here if I ever do run into real trouble. I know that this organization will have my back. I think every organization on the planet ought to have one of these programs, right, that shows up for people when they're suffering, and I'm kind of stunned that we don't see that very often.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the phrase have a heart. There's an article in today's New York Times that when doing surveys of prospective employees and asking them, what's the most important thing about a company that you're going to work for? Is it the product or the industry or your pay or your title? They all respond, or a higher percentage respond, I want to work for a company that has a heart. I want to work for a company that gives back. I want to work for a company that allows me to volunteer. I want to work for a company where I'm proud of people I'm working side by side with. And is that your experience?
Yeah, very much so. So if you look at nationally representative data on Americans and you ask them what they want out of work, number one for every generation is meaning. People want to be part of an organization that adds meaning to their lives, but also where they can add meaning to other people's lives. And if you look at where meaning comes from, meaning does not come from anything self-focused, right? It comes from the time you spend helping others, whether that's through your job or volunteering or both. And I think that this is one of the reasons why it's so great to have role models like Mark here saying, look, companies ought to stand for something that's more than just profits. And I think that pride, if you look at why people are proud to work for a company, it rarely has anything to do with a company being high achieving or outperforming competitors. It's about what the company contributes to the world and then feeling like there's a line of sight between what I do every day and what the company gives back. So yeah, I guess I'm preaching to the choir on that one.
Yeah, I do want to make two observations about talking on this stage right at this moment. First, I'm sorry about the people in the back. I mean, we're not showing you our best side. And
speak for yourself.
I'm indifferent, actually. And you may have thought that we'd run out of time because the ticker went down to 0. You may notice they've restarted it and put 8 more minutes on the timer. Ooh. So that allows us to ask the question, what surprised you the most in talking to people who either were going through adversity, who had bounced back, or for whom adversity had broken them? What did you learn the most, and what surprised you the most?
Oh, there were a lot of surprises. So the first one that jumped out was, how many people have heard of post-traumatic stress, like PTSD? Okay, how many of you have heard of post-traumatic growth? Only a few of you. So if you look at trauma, roughly about 15% of people will go through PTSD at some point in their lives after facing trauma. And they will experience some kind of debilitating depression, anxiety, intrusive thoughts. Roughly half of people who face tragedy actually experience post-traumatic growth. So what is that? Tedeschi and Calhoun, these psychologists, they went and looked at people who'd gone through some of the worst trauma imaginable. They studied parents who lost children. They studied survivors of rape, of war, of imprisonment. And they asked them, what is your life like now? 2, 3, 5 years down the road. And about half of people, regardless of what the tragedy was, said, my life is better in some way as a result of this. And they were like, like what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, your life is worse by definition. And people said, look, I would give anything to go back, right? And be able to rewind the clock. And I'm sadder, but I've also become stronger. I know if I got through that, I can get through anything. I am more grateful. I have a sense of appreciation for the things in my life that matter that I never did before. I'm closer to people who were there for me. And I have deeper relationships that I didn't have before. And I have found meaning in, helping others go through the kind of tragedy that I faced. And we find over and over again that when people face tragedy, they often become more compassionate. And what's interesting is they don't just become compassionate across the board, they're especially motivated to help people through, the kind of thing that they've gone through themselves. And I think one of the reasons for that is it doesn't just give their lives meaning, it actually gives their suffering meaning, right? To say, look, maybe this didn't happen for a reason, but I can give it a reason, right? I can make this into something that makes the world a little bit better, that makes other people's lives a little bit better. And so that was a surprise, right? That alongside the sadness, it's possible to not just bounce back, but also bounce forward. I think the other surprise for me was just when people ask the question, like, how do I support others? About how often we struggle. I thought I was like one of the only people who doesn't know what to say when somebody goes through loss or gets diagnosed with cancer. And it turns out most people are sort of at a loss for what to do. And I think as a result, what a lot of us do is we don't say anything because we don't want to remind people of their tragedy. And this is kind of an absurd concept. Like Cheryl would say, like, you can't remind her that her husband died. She knows that. And I think that we probably all need to get better at calling out the elephant in the room, right? Being able to say, look, I know this happened, and I just wanted to see, like, how are you doing today? Another thing that I learned was I, for years, have said to people when they were struggling, I've said, please let me know if there's anything I could do. And I thought that was the perfect way to like say, look, I'm here for you, but I don't want to impose, and I don't necessarily know what you need. I now know that all I was doing was putting a burden on the person to know what they needed and to feel comfortable asking. And that it's way more helpful, instead of offering to do anything, to just show up and do something. So we've come across some pretty remarkable examples of this. One of my favorites was, Cheryl and I have a colleague, Dan Levy, who had a son who was in the hospital. And a friend showed up in the hospital and texted him and said, what do you not want on a burger? And it was like, okay, I'm going to get you a meal. Like, let me give you a little bit of choice, but I'm just going to do something for you. And then said, I'm in the lobby of the hospital, and I'll be here for the next hour. If you want to come down for a hug, I'll be here whether you do or not. And it's such a small act that shows other people that you are willing to be there for them. And I think we could probably all show up a little bit more like that. You don't have to be somebody's friend since the 3rd grade to do that. It is a little creepy if you show up at a stranger's house with a home-cooked meal. But I think that was a surprise to me, just that there's simple ways that we could all show up and be there for each other.
There's a lot of research on PTSD, tremendous new therapies. Chaplain Earl is going to be speaking later today about the dilemma that many young Black NFL players face about balancing patriotism with this opportunity to be on the world stage and protest the deaths of young Black men in encounters with police. It's interesting to know, if you talk to any of the captains in the police force or any of the superintendents of police, as I have, they'll tell you that the nature of policing is changing in one important way related to PTSD, which is a high, maybe 50% or 70% of the police that they're hiring are veterans. And these are veterans who've come from Iraq War and they've come from Afghanistan, where to reach for your gun is often the difference in life and death. Now when they're in a civilian capacity and they are victims of PTSD, they're suffering from PTSD, when they encounter a stressful place, they go back to who they were in Iraq. And I just wondered if you have anything to say about that, these kind of learned PTSD-like responses.
So, certainly not my expertise, but I will say as a consumer of evidence in this area, not a producer, it's interesting that one of the things that stress does to people is it increases the probability of our dominant response. So under stress, we go into autopilot pretty quickly. And I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is we can try to practice the response that we want to show and change what that autopilot looks like. So in a much more conventional setting that I think probably applies to everyone in this room, one of the things I do a lot with leaders and managers is we work on identifying their emotional triggers. So think about Dan Goleman would call it an amygdala hijacking, right? Like the moments where you're seeing red and you fly off the handle and you're like, what was I thinking? And biologically you weren't thinking, right? You bypassed your sort of conscious thought and you just reacted with sort of fight or flight. Well, one of the things that's clear about that is we all have different emotional triggers that we built up over time. So there's an event that set you off, and then you start to associate that event with a really negative response, and then it's very easy to activate that response again. And so one of the things we've done is we've actually trained leaders and managers to identify their triggers. So you can all do this. Think about like the last 3 or 4 times that you completely lost it with someone else, and then look at the patterns. What do those moments have in common? For me, I found that like one of my biggest triggers was people feigning knowledge. So people like claiming that they know things that they don't. For a lot of other people, it's selfishness, it's disrespect, it's injustice. And once you identify those, you can actually start to write a script for how you want to respond. And if you rehearse that script enough, it's a little bit more likely to show. So I'll give you my example on this one. I was working with an investment bank, which is just an inherent trigger for me by itself. But I spent a whole summer trying to figure out how to motivate their employees and how to do a better job attracting and retaining junior people. And then I'm presenting my findings, and I had 26 recommendations, and the senior leader, who is our point, said, why don't we just pay them more? And I don't even remember this, but apparently my response was, I've never seen smart people act so dumb. Clearly an amygdala hijacking. And so after that, I had to sort of script, like, how do I want to respond when somebody questions my evidence? And I said, well, what I really want to do is I want to get curious. And what I would love to ask is just like, that's so interesting. What data would you need to change your mind? And try to reframe the conversation around evidence. And so I practiced that script over and over again. And about half the time now when somebody responds like that, I will ask them that question, like, hey, what information would you need to change your mind? And very often they'll outline a study that I already have. I'm like, great, I'll convince you on your terms now. But I think that we could all probably identify those triggers and practice the scripts for how we want to engage with other people.
Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Grant, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Larry.